All right, so I'll be talking today about this Mind the Gap paper. And one of the reasons why this was really interesting to me was because of how we've previously had to struggle a lot with the disjointed embedding problem, where we were trying to map a new modality space of the brain into the standard clip space of text and images. So for our mind-eye fMRI to image pipeline, we do contrastive learning, right? Where we basically freeze the clip image embeddings and then use contrastive loss to figure out a new brain embedding space that can make use of our paired brain image data sets. But when you do contrastive learning, we find that the embeddings for the two modalities, orange is the brain modality space, blue is the clip image space. You get this disjointed embedding spaces when you do dimensionality reduction on it. So this is what is meant by the modality gap that the paper talks about, right? It's when you have these two modalities that you're trying to align with contrastive learning, but when you actually visualize it and reduce the dimensions to 2 in this example using UMAP, but you can use PCA or anything, you notice that there's this big gap between the embeddings, right? And so for the mind-eye paper, what we had to do was train a separate diffusion prior that aligns the two modalities to resolve the modality gap such that we can interchangeably feed a model that's pre-trained with clip image latents to accept, in this case, the clip fMRI latents, and be able to use it just fine where the magnitude and the direction of the samples are interchangeable. But in this case, when you do this UMAP plot with clip image, clip fMRI, same thing happens apparently for all multimodal models. So if I were to plot a UMAP plot like this on the left for clip text and clip image, you would also see a similar modality gap. And that is preserved across apparently all multimodal models. So this paper that this came out last year in NeurIPS, they talk about this phenomenon, which apparently everybody has encountered, but few papers have talked about. So they term it the modality gap, this geometric phenomenon where there's this gap that seems to come out of all of these contrastively trained multimodal models. And the question is, why does it emerge? Is there anything we can do about it? And what does this gap mean for downstream applications? So just summarizing the abstract here, they show that this phenomenon of the modality gap is not due to contrastive learning specifically. It's actually a more general phenomenon that emerges as early as model initialization. And the contrastive learning part is preserving that gap and then sometimes decreasing it. And so they talk about how it's a more general phenomenon than previously considered. And they furthermore show that it can emerge even if you have random model initialization, random model weights, the gap still comes out. And so they try to figure out why that's happening. And then they do some experiments about what that means for downstream applications. So I'm going to talk kind of an overview of my takeaways of this paper. So first off, let's go to figure 1 here. So this is kind of a toy depiction of how clip gets trained with contrastive loss. So we have images here and their corresponding text caption pairs here. So image 1 might be a dog, text 1 might be a description of that dog, where is the dog, something describing the picture correctly. So you have this paired data set, and you have 2 encoders. So the images get transformed into this red latent space. The text gets transformed through this different encoder to the blue latent space. They're the same dimensionality here. They're in the same embedding space. And what the model's trying to do is to maximize the similarity of the paired latents and minimize the similarity for the negative pairs like 1 and 2, 2 and 3, so on. And importantly, these latents, before you do the comparisons to get the contrastive loss, you L2 normalize them. And that's important because basically you're throwing out the magnitude information, you're standardizing the inputs. So let me draw something here. So like typically you have vector direction, vector magnitude. If you L2 norm, all you have is the direction, right? And so when you do the L2 norming, the embedding space, this hyperdimensional arbitrary latent space, is basically reduced to a unit sphere with n dimensions. And so you can have different directions on here, but you don't have different magnitudes. And so when I say something like cosine similarity, what I mean by that is you're literally just taking the cosine angle of the two latents in the hyperdimensional space. So for instance, if I'm taking the cosine similarity of this latent and this latent, maybe that's a right angle. That's literally the cosine 90 degrees. And so they're orthogonal. And so the cosine similarity is 0. Meanwhile, cosine similarity is 1. If they're on top of each other, they have the same direction. Cosine similarity is -1 if they're opposite, right? And so you can basically imagine that the hyperdimensional space in a 2D example, it would be a circle, but otherwise it's like this impossible to visualize sphere of n dimensions. So that's what we're working with clip.
That's a cool question.
Yeah.
No, that's true for basically within the same modalities. Like that's how like language processing and a lot of vision stuff works. Now that this is multimodal, do you like sort of combine the modalities and do the same thing? Like you put them into the same embedding space, or is it separate? I'm just curious.
So do you mean with like more than 2 modalities, or are you
Yeah, more
talking
than
about
2.
specifically? Oh, okay. Yeah, it would get all into the same space, but it kind of depends on how you do it. Like ImageFind, they specifically do basically this same setup, but they do it multiple times, swapping out one of the modalities and keeping the image modality. But in all cases, yeah, you're projecting it into the same space and then doing whatever contrastive loss to similarly like maximize the paired similarities, minimize the negative pair.
Got it.
Yeah, so I guess in all cases you're still doing this kind of cosine similarity pair, positive pair, negative pair kind of loss function. But as we'll see, it's this kind of L2 normalization that's really important for the reason why we have this disjointness. And partly that's because we're only caring about the vector direction, not the magnitude. And so here are lots of different multimodal models, right? So we've got clip, video clip, medical image, amino acid sequencing. In all cases, if you visualize the two modalities using UMAP, you get this modality gap. Any questions before I keep going? Okay, so this is a kind of weird thing with figure 1C. This is initialization random, AKA imagine that you take the clip model and you are on training epoch 0. So you haven't actually started training. So everything's randomly initialized. And you then do the UMAP dimensionality reduction. That still produces the modality gap. So that's kind of weird because at least my assumption was that the contrastive training was somehow learning to represent the modalities differently, but apparently that's not the case. So as early on as the very beginning of the model initialization, you still get this modality gap. So this paper, I'll just summarize the main takeaways here before going into the why behind all this. But they explain that this modality gap is not specific to contrastive learning, really. It's more of a general property when you have multiple encoders that go to the same embedding space, and that this distance, the amount of modality gap, does affect the model. So it doesn't affect it in a straightforward way. It's kind of a non-intuitive way that the gap can affect downstream applications, which we can talk about, but it does make a difference. And part of the reason for this general phenomenon of the gap is due to this thing that they talk about called the cone effect, which is we'll talk about when we get there in the paper. And specifically, some of the underlying reasons for the cone effect happening, which explains the modality gap, is the encoders having a nonlinear activation function. So first, let's talk about the cone effect, right? So what even is a cone in this hyperdimensional space, right? So basically, actually, they have a good paragraph here that I think illustrates it better, talking about the cone in terms of the surface area taken up by the embedding space. So imagine that you are in 2D, right? And so you have a unit circle. After you do the L2 norm, you're in a unit circle. If you have two vectors that are pretty similar to each other, like in this example, 0.56, right? So maximum similarity would be 1. Then the surface area taken up by that circle is 15.53%, right? So we're more so talking about averages. So you can imagine there's like a lot of different latents here, and they average together to have an average cosine similarity of 0.56, and then you take the average surface area of the circle. But you can kind of interpret it as like most of this embedding space is not really that informative for describing these embeddings because they're all more or less pointing in the same direction, right? So they're all more or less pointing towards this side of the circle. And if you scale this up to like a 3-dimensional embedding space, which I'll try to illustrate with like an ellipse in the middle, then if you have the same property of the average cosine similarity being 0.56, so something like this, you can imagine that the surface area is kind of like a spherical cap on the outside of this sphere, like this. And so if you do the trigonometry to figure out the surface area taken up in this example, it's only 3.34% of the total surface area. And I think this is where the idea of a cone comes from, because they're all more or less pointing to the same spot, right? From the origin, pointing to the same spot roughly, like this. And you can kind of see that forming as a cone, I think. At least that's my sort of intuition behind why they talk about this as a cone effect, because these are vector directions, right? And they're all more or less pointing to the same place from the origin. And so the narrowness of the cone is getting more narrow as the number of dimensions goes up. So as this goes up, the cone gets more narrow. And what that means is that the effective embedding space for the model is decreasing. So less of the embedding space is relevant. when your number of dimensions goes up and up and up. And so if you scale this to a 512 dimensional hyperdimensional space, then instead of 3.34%, it's some minuscule value. And so they describe this as an extremely narrow cone, right? So this is the sort of logic of what they talk about as the cone effect, if that makes sense. And essentially this cone exists, this property of the cone getting narrower and narrower, this will always exist in a multidimensional like embedding space as long as the cosine similarity is positive, right? So as long as you have a positive cosine similarity, then you're going to produce cones like this. And so as the number of dimensions scales up, the modality gap becomes easier and easier to create. And they demonstrate this in here, figure 2. So the reasoning for let's look at figure 2a at the top left here. So you can see that if you have ResNet and you randomly initialize the model and use random noise, the average cosine similarity is basically 1. In other words, the cone is so extremely narrow that the cosine similarity just ends up converging to 1. And the contrastive learning actually makes the cone less narrow. So it's actually helping with the modality gap, not causing the modality gap. As they pre-train it and use real data, the cosine similarities become more variable, which makes sense because if you think about how the model gets trained, right, it's like you have to have these vectors that have information because you have positive pairs that need to be maximized in terms of similarity and negative pairs that need to be minimized. And if everything is already at cosine of similarity of 1, then there's no information to be drawn from that. And so that's my understanding, at least, for why the contrastive learning is actually reducing, is actually helping with the modality gap in the sense of having more variation in the embeddings. And this is kind of hard to wrap your head around, I think. So let me know if you have any questions. Okay, so, all right, glad I explained that, Yash. Effective embedding space. I'm not sure if they like explicitly define that, Rohan. My understanding, just from how it's being used in that paragraph, is like the effective embedding space in the sense that all like the vectors can be described using just that portion of the embedding space. So if you have 512 dimensional hypersphere, you're only using a small portion of that sphere to describe all of the information contained in the embeddings. So that's kind of the analogy to surface area. You only need that small sliver of a cone in the hypersphere to effectively describe all of the latents that are being output from the encoder. So then the obvious question then is, why is it producing the cones, right? So why is it that we're getting near 1 cosine similarity from random model initialization and weights? And in this plot on the right here, figure 2b, you'll see that they use different activation functions for the encoder. So remember that we have like an image, this is a face, and then that goes through an encoder, and then that gives you the latent. But then there's a separate encoder here that takes something like text, right? And so I'm talking about the activation function of these encoders. And if you randomly initialize both of these encoders, right? If you're at starting point 0, then where the cone is going to be is totally random, right? So it could be here for encoder 1, and it might be here for encoder 2. So because they're separately randomly initialized, you're going to get this gap between 1 and 2. But if you have a different activation function for these encoders, that will affect how this cone effect emerges. And apparently it seems to be driven by having a nonlinear activation function. So specifically ReLU and sigmoid, these are making it so that you can only have positive values output from that nonlinear activation function, meaning that the cosine similarity has to be positive, right? Everything, if the values are all positive, you can't have a negative value, and the cosine similarity has to be positive as well. And like I said, you get the cone effect as a sort of generalizable phenomenon with hyperspheres, assuming that the cosine similarity is positive. So if you have linear activation function, you don't get the cone effect and you don't get the modality gap. If you have something that's kind of in between, like 10, then I guess you get something in between. But it's these activation functions that are seemingly to be driving this geometric phenomenon based on having to have an output that is positive. Now, they even do experiments on top of this, like what if you do ReLU and then you do something else after the ReLU before it goes to the latent space? Or what if you do normalization stuff? And all of those seem to not address the effect. So the effect persisted even if you have additional stuff that happens after the ReLUs. So it seems to be a pretty pervasive thing that's not that easy to get rid of. And I'm not sure if they really explain the logic of why exactly the math works out of why positive cosine similarities produce a narrow cone like that. I was trying to explain things from a sort of intuition approach, but I couldn't really get the real reasoning. Maybe it's somewhere in the math proofs that I didn't fully digest, but I guess I'm talking more about the practical outputs rather than the real mathematical reasoning behind why this emerges in geometric spaces like that. So,
Hey, Paul, could I ask a quick question? I think you said it just briefly, but is it true that they got this effect even when they didn't have the activation on the last layer? Say it was just like a linear projection as the last layer to get the embedding. Even in that case, they still see this difference based on the internal activation function?
yeah. So if there was a ReLU somewhere in the encoder, it will produce the effect. If there's no ReLU, like then you don't get the cone effect.
Got it. Do you remember this idea of the dead ReLUs?
Dead ReLU? I don't know what that is.
It's like some term that people used to like it's like a pathological breakdown of the neural networks with ReLUs where some of the units never get active because they're in like that 0 portion of the activation. Anyway, I just feel like it could be the case that with these internal nonlinearities, if some of them are never getting active and are always in the constant output regime, then you would kind of get this breakdown in terms of the diversity of embeddings that you see.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm not really familiar with the dead ReLUs idea, but
Yeah, hold up.
maybe I'll look
All right,
that
you
up.
keep going. I'll look it up.
All right. Yeah, so the next thing that they do is they talk about, they talk about it from a sort of results perspective of this nonlinear activation effect. And so here, like in this sentence, it says, it's easy to see that ReLU makes every coordinate non-negative, thus the cosine similarity is guaranteed to be positive. However, we highlight that this basically extends to models where ReLU is not the final layer. So and it also extends when the models have batch norm, layer norm stuff. So I don't really know if they have a great explanation for why this property leads to the cone effect, but an interesting direction for future work. And it's also possible I just didn't really understand the later sections with all the math proofs. So and I already talked about how the different random initializations create different cones. So I'll skip ahead to this section. So they did some experiments on this modality gap stuff. Thanks for the link, Connor. I'll look at that after this. So the experiments that they did is, what if you force the embeddings to not have a modality gap, essentially? So they manually can shift the two modalities on top of each other and then see how that affects things like the contrastive loss. And they can also vary the temperature of the contrastive learning and see how that affects things. So what they find is that if you decrease the distance of the modality gap, it will not improve your contrastive loss typically. So you can see when the Euclidean distance in this plot is 0, the validation loss, aka the contrastive loss, you want lower values, gets worse. So the whole aim of the model is to have like a really good performing multimodal model where you can compute similarities between the positive pairs. It's not going to do as well when the modality gap is shrunk to 0. But it's also not going to do as well when the modality gap is increased. There's kind of a sweet spot that the original CLIP model just somehow happened to already hit. Maybe they had already explored it themselves. The dotted line is the actual OpenAI CLIP models where it lies. So it's not a simple thing of increase or decrease the modality gap distance and you'll have a better performing model. There seems to be a sort of sweet spot, except if the temperature is 1, so if you increase the temperature a lot, then the Euclidean distance being 0 does happen to result in the best validation loss. But if your temperature is that high, the overall validation loss is really bad. So generally, you're going to want a temperature that's lower than 1 in these contrastive models. And so that's what like these plots are showing, where it's not obvious what the distance should be to reach optimal performance. They also do some experiments with temperature. I feel like this plot is not the best one. There was another plot at the end in figure 8 that showed this better. Figure 8 here. So by changing the temperature, you can change the gap. So one easy way to reduce or increase the modality gap, if you're training a contrastive model, is to change the temperature parameter. Higher temperature means lower gap. And so you see that with this visualization where if the temperature is 1, they're highly overlapping, but the overall performance again for the model is not as good. But if you are wanting to experiment with changing the gap between maybe more reasonable temperatures, then this would be probably the easiest way to do it. Just change the temperature parameter for the model. So What else? This one was interesting. So they also experimented with what if you force the random initialization to be the same between the two models, right? So if you do random initialization for the two encoders, then the gap is going to be pretty big. But you can pick the model initialization, right? What if you happen to use the model initialization that results in no gap at the very beginning of model training? So the gap in this case being 0.038. And then you do the contrastive learning. In that case, they find that for the original model with the big gap, contrastive learning decreased the gap, right? So that's consistent with the figure 2 from before. But for the model that was forcibly initialized such that there was a 0 gap, and for the model that was initialized to already have 0 gap, the contrastive learning actually increased the modality gap. So in the examples from before, the figure 2 had the contrastive learning helping with the modality gap, but that was probably because the random initialization had already created this like bad spacing that, or not bad, but larger modality gap than would be useful. So it's not a simple, easy thing to correct. So you can kind of decrease the modality gap during the contrastive training if you force the initializations for both the encoders to land in a good spot. So again, this is kind of like forcing the one encoder to overlap with the second one at the very beginning, but it's not really something that you can solve, it seems. So it doesn't seem like there's a way to get around the fact that contrastive learning works by having disjointed spaces. You can vary the gap to some degree, but not entirely. You can't increase it or decrease it all the way. It's not an easy way to make the model do better. So regarding downstream applications, right? So the gap does have some downstream effects on the outputs from the model. So one interesting thing that they did was I'll talk about this one. They used CLIP and Fairface the Fairface data set. So these are images of people of different ages and races and things. And so they tried to compute the bias of the model. So for instance, you don't want there to be a systematic like bias of the model to be racist or ageist or something. And so they have these classes like animal, thief, and you can compute the similarities and see if there's a bias for certain types of images in the data set. And they found that by increasing the gap of the model, it reduced the bias overall with very minimal impact to the overall top one accuracy. However, again, it's not as simple as a solution as increase the gap, you'll have a less biased model. Because if you increase the gap too much or too little, or you shrink the gap, then different kind of biases can emerge. So if the gap is too small, then crime-related biases became more prevalent. If the gap was too large, then non-human biases became more prevalent. So it was kind of a trade-off. But I suppose a good takeaway from this is that if you are concerned about bias of a model, one easy way to tweak the bias is to experiment with, say, the temperature parameter, which will affect the gap of the modality. Any questions or comments so far? I think that's basically the gist of the paper.
thought it was interesting how you talked about the fact that even if you start with zero gap, once you run the contrastive learning, you will end up with some gap created. I was kind of wondering, do you know if it's true that in CLIP, you know how in the contrastive loss you have the positive and you have the negative examples? Is it true that in CLIP all the negative examples are across modality?
Across modality?
If I'm doing image text, contrastive learning with CLIP, all of my negative examples are between image and text, right?
Yes.
So I feel like that might have an average effect of pushing apart the modalities. Maybe if you added within modality negatives, like the way you usually do in SimClear and other contrast, like single modality contrastive learning setups, you would not get this automatic modality gap created.
That's a great point, actually. Yeah. It's sort of like, yes, it's a general phenomenon that will exist if you have two encoders going to the same space. But yeah, if you can remove the gap by fixing the initializations to be lining up in the general correct way, then it's basically a problem of the contrastive loss increasing the gap again. But maybe there's a way to specifically address that, in which case you could do this sort of multimodal learning without a gap.
Yeah, right? Exactly. There's something going on with it. It's something to do with the loss, like you said.
Yeah.
And it's like a very hazy intuition, but it feels like when you have all these negative examples and all the negative examples are between the modalities, you're just telling the network to push apart those negative examples over and over again. And it might overgeneralize and think I should just push these modalities apart a little bit and get most of these negative examples right. But yeah, I bet adding within modality negatives would help.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point, actually. I wonder, that would be pretty simple to test too, because because it really does seem like this is more of like a practical paper. Like this is the effect. We tried randomizing stuff, the effects still happen. We tried different activation functions. The nonlinear ones gave us the effect. If you don't have nonlinear, then it's not preserved. It's a general phenomenon, etc. But they don't really talk about like the specifics of contrastive loss, how that decreases or increases the gap exactly. They show that it helps, but can also hurt. And intuitively, your point makes a lot of sense because you're forcing the comparisons always to be with the other modality.
Yeah. That's also, it's an interesting thing that you kind of get at, is that they have two different explanations going on. They have one that relates to like the fundamentals of neural networks with nonlinear activations, creating this small cone. And then it seems like the effect from the contrastive loss is totally independent and it doesn't get as much treatment.
Yeah, they're very, a lot of the paper talks about, like hammers home the message of, it's not a contrastive model. It's not contrastive learning that creates the modality effect, even though basically everyone talks about the modality effect when talking about contrastive multimodal models. It's a general property of two encoders going to the same space. But because of that, maybe it seems like there's a lot more priority based on that finding.
Yeah, it is interesting, probably. And yeah, I haven't really thought about that.
But I think it's like a really important question, right? Like, is it possible to train these multimodal models to the same level of performance, right? Because they show that you can reduce the gap entirely turn the temperature to 1, but then the contrastive mechanism doesn't work as well. So if there is a way to not have the performance loss with the modality gap not being minimized as much as possible, then that could potentially help in many cases. For instance, our mind-eye model, right? Like you can imagine many different models that have to deal with this problem, which if you could solve it would be really great.
Yeah, it feels like there should be a trick to solve it. Like you mentioned that they are able to force the gap to be 0 in a post hoc sort of way. Like, do they just kind of center the embeddings on a fixed vector? Or
Yeah, the way that they do it is, yeah, what you said. They can just change the mean. They can just toy with the values until they're overlapping on top of each other. So that's the way that they do it for the experiments like this. So they literally just shift
right?
the embeddings. But yeah, the other ways that they talk about is like changing the temperature or forcing the model initializations to be the same.
Do you know if the downstream performance is much worse with temperature 1? Because the contrastive loss value is not really comparable between the temperatures.
I mean, I think they don't really. They basically they show this plot, right? Like where
Right.
it's worse throughout the entirety of it, but it is the case where best performance does exist at the minimal. So like this is what you would want if the y-axis were better. But I don't think that they talk much more about like the downstreams of it.
Yeah,
Like they
which is
didn't do
like,
the same test for like the bias with temperature 1, I believe.
right.
I guess I didn't talk about this table, but in this one they show like for different models, increasing or decreasing the modality gap results in better performance. So just further showing that there's not a straightforward way to know what gap you want. It depends on the model and everything, what gap distance results in the best performance at the end.
Were you convinced by this table?
By this
I was
one?
just about to ask the same thing.
I mean, what do you think?
What does anyone else think?
I mean, the modified gap just did not seem to be that much bigger. I don't know. I guess I don't have a great sense of these things. I'm just like, maybe. It sort of seems like trivial improvements in a lot of the time, depending on the data set. But yeah.
Yeah. I think if you just get one more knob to turn, then the number can only go up with an extra knob to turn. And the fact that they sometimes increase the gap and sometimes shrink the gap makes the
I
story
mean,
harder to buy.
my takeaway wasn't, hey, when we build models, we should toy with the gap to increase performance. My takeaway was the gap has a non-linear, like a not straightforward change to the loss landscape. So like one interpretation that I initially was thinking is maybe there's like a trade-off where increase the gap as much as possible, and that will help the model do the contrastive loss. But clearly that's not the case. So I mean, that was my simple takeaway from it.
Yeah, that's nicer. You're better. but I think that's fair.
And I bet people already play around with the temperature parameter a lot when they train these models anyway, so they just are accidentally also playing around with the modality gap.
Oh yeah, for sure. It is kind of an annoying hyperparameter.
Yeah.
You don't usually have hyperparameters on your laws. Do you?
I mean, it's like a hyperparameter that you don't even really know what it should be. So like you can even make it a learnable parameter. But at least for MindEye, when we did that, when we made it a learnable parameter, it didn't do as well. So it's not like that solves it. You still have to kind of tinker around with it. Anyone else have any thoughts on the paper?
I think it was a really good presentation. I loved going over through this paper.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great paper. I mean, I wish I would be able to know how to fix this problem from reading the paper. I thought maybe there was a chance I would finally be able to understand this and like crack the code. But even though that didn't happen, obviously, it's very important that finally there's a paper that actually goes in detail about this kind of weird emergent behavior that seems to pop out when you train multimodal models. You know, it's kind of eerie, like, oh, why are they separating like this? I don't have an explicit loss to push them apart. But now we kind of understand. And I think it's helpful to also maybe be able to visualize the kind of cone effect. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess I can end it, but based on Connor's suggestion, I feel like there's some room to actually explore this more. I think it would, you know, be a paper in its own right to to toy around with slightly changing how that loss can handle the positive and negative pairs within and across modalities, and see if, given that you set the model initialization to have no gap at the start, can you then do the good performance on the contrastive model without increasing the gap? That would be really cool, actually. So you might want to think about trying a toy implementation of that. I'd be excited. But okay, yeah, awesome. Thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, take care.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate the presentation. It's a neat paper.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the comments and everything.
Yeah, it's fun. I love talking about papers. All right. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Have a good weekend. And if anyone wants to present a paper for any of the future next weeks, please get in touch. I feel like you get a lot of insight about a paper if you're forced to present on it. I know that I read this deeper than I normally would read a paper because of it. So yeah. Yeah, okay. Take care.